Tanya Vuichard was the kind of person who showed up early, stayed late, and never left anything unfinished. She was 59 years old, a veteran educator at a public school in Michigan, reliable, composed, and respected. She had worked there for over 20 years, never missing a day without notice. People like Tanya don't just vanish. That's why the silence hit differently. On what should have been a routine weekday morning, Tanya didn't arrive for work. No sick call, no message, nothing. At first, colleagues assumed it was an oversight, maybe a last-minute emergency. But by mid-morning, the concern grew. Her car was reportedly still parked at her home in Commerce Township. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard from her. It was her co-workers who contacted police, long before family did. That detail would stand out later. Deputies from the Oakland County Sheriff's Department were dispatched to the Vuichard home, a quiet suburban house in a well-kept neighborhood. When they knocked on the door, there was no immediate answer. But within minutes, the man inside, Vincent Vuichard, Tanya's husband, opened the door. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't surprised. He didn't ask why they were there. "She's not here," he said. "She left early." They asked where she went. He said errands. Asked if she took her car. He said no. Her purse and phone were still inside the house. The answers didn't line up. The officers noticed scratches on his cheek and bruising near the collarbone. Small, fresh injuries. He claimed they were from shaving and a bump into a shelf. It wasn't convincing. Inside the home, there was no immediate sign of a struggle. The living room was orderly, the kitchen tidy, but something about the atmosphere was off. Too quiet, too sterile. It didn't feel like anyone had lived there in the past 24 hours. Yet all of Tanya's personal items were untouched. The officers asked to check upstairs. Vincent didn't object. In the bathroom, they noticed the smell first. A strong chemical scent, cleaning agents, overused. The tile floor gleamed unnaturally. A bath mat had been replaced. And at the center of the floor, partially covered by a towel, was a large bundle. They paused. One of them asked what it was. Vincent looked at the floor. His voice was almost casual. "That's her." The bundle was unwrapped slowly. Inside were black garbage bags, and within them, the body of Tanya Vuichard. She had been killed by a sharp force injury to the neck. There were no signs of a defensive struggle. Her body had been carefully wrapped in a quilt, cleaned, moved, hidden. There was no emergency call, no attempt to flee, no claim of self-defense. Just a woman reported missing by her co-workers and found dead in her own bathroom hours later. The case was no longer a missing person. It was a homicide, and the investigation had only just begun. The moment a body is discovered inside a residence, everything changes. The home is no longer a private space. It becomes a crime scene. That shift is immediate and absolute. Officers who had walked in cautiously hours earlier now stood on alert. Procedures activated. Tape went up. No one in, no one out. The house was sealed. Commerce Township, a place where sirens were rare, now hosted a perimeter of patrol cars and evidence techs. The neighbors stayed inside, blinds tilted, watching without being seen. In the driveway, Tanya Vuichard's car remained parked, untouched. In the home, her life had been stopped, and investigators had to determine exactly when, how, and by whom. Inside the residence, first responders stepped back and gave way to the forensic team. No assumptions were made, no accusations. But every movement from that point forward was documented with the meticulousness of procedure. The goal wasn't to theorize, it was to preserve, observe, and collect. The bathroom where Tanya's body had been found was immediately cordoned off. Evidence markers were placed. The air, heavily scented with chemical cleaner, hinted at a recent attempt to sanitize. But nothing is ever truly erased. DNA, even when invisible, remains traceable. Technicians collected fibers from the quilt that had been used to wrap the victim. They scraped areas around the tile base, swabbed the floor, and bagged the garbage bags that had enclosed the body. Each item told a piece of a story, if not in words, then in biology, pattern, and time. Simultaneously, officers conducted a protective sweep of the rest of the house. No one else was present. No hidden rooms. No signs of entry or exit that weren't accounted for. The home was in order, too much so. There was no chaos, no broken glass, no signs of a robbery or an outside altercation. It had all taken place within these walls, quietly. Outside, lead investigators began their work on logistics. Who last spoke to Tanya? Who saw her alive last? Who had access to the house? Initial reports confirmed she hadn't arrived at school as expected. There were no signs of her attempting to leave. Her phone had remained inside the house. Her purse was untouched. Her calendar on the kitchen wall still showed appointments for the week ahead. Digital forensics joined the scene. Her phone was extracted, and its contents imaged. Texts, emails, and browser history would be examined later. For now, the goal was to secure every potential source of evidence before it degraded or was tampered with. Back at the station, dispatch logs were reviewed. No 911 calls had come from the Bouchard residence. No prior complaints of domestic disturbances. Nothing that would suggest a history of violence. That absence, however, didn't clear suspicion. Sometimes silence is its own red flag. Detectives made an initial list of people to interview: co-workers, neighbors, relatives. The focus was on narrowing the timeline. Tanya had last been seen by school staff the previous weekday. Her car hadn't moved since. There were no known visitors. Her husband, who had remained in the home, stated she had gone out early. That claim now sat in direct contradiction with physical evidence. The behavioral response of the person present during the search was noted, but not interpreted. That would come later. Investigators are trained to avoid premature conclusions. They don't rely on gut feelings. They rely on facts, contradictions, and the weight of consistency, or the lack of it. By evening, a search warrant was issued for the entire home and all connected property. That included the garage, the backyard, and the vehicle in the driveway. Inside the SUV, forensic investigators discovered another trash bag. This one contained several items of interest: a set of rubber gloves, stained paper towels, and what appeared to be bathroom linens consistent with the rest of the household inventory. The gloves showed signs of moisture. The towels tested presumptively positive for blood. At this stage, the case transitioned from discovery to containment. Detectives had not yet filed charges, but the evidence spoke with increasing clarity. The crime had occurred within the home. The body had been concealed, not disposed of. The actions taken after Tanya's death suggested a desire to cover, not confess. Interviews began with Tanya's co-workers. Most described her as punctual, quiet, and kind. She kept her personal life separate from her work. A few noted that she rarely spoke about her husband. One co-worker recalled a conversation weeks earlier in which Tanya mentioned feeling stifled at home, but the comment had been brief and not expanded upon. No one recalled her ever expressing fear. Her relatives described her as reserved, dedicated to her students. She didn't travel much. She didn't engage in loud arguments or drama. She had, to all accounts, simply vanished from her routine. But when routine is broken in a controlled, planned life like Tanya's, it isn't random. It's a rupture. Detectives returned to the home with a clearer view. They revisited the placement of objects in the bathroom, the missing bath mat, the alignment of items under the sink, the replaced towel rack, all subtle indicators of someone attempting to reset the room. But it's the small inconsistencies that often break a case. The working theory at this stage wasn't stated aloud, but it was understood. The person responsible had not left the house. The timeline, the physical evidence, and the complete lack of external intrusion all pointed inward. Still, law enforcement had to proceed without bias. They continued processing the scene, combing through Tanya's communications and expanding the perimeter of information gathering. No arrest was made that day, but suspicion had narrowed. The silence in that house had been broken, but only just. There are cases where the crime scene speaks for itself. Chaotic, violent, loud. This wasn't one of them. What happened inside the Bouchard home didn't leave shattered glass or screams across the neighborhood. Instead, it left a silence that had built for years and finally settled into something irreversible. In the aftermath of the initial search and evidence collection, investigators turned their attention to the people who had known Tanya Bouchard best, or at least had spent the most time with her. It quickly became apparent that knowing her and understanding her were not the same. She was regarded as disciplined, never late, never unprepared. To her students, she was warm but firm. To her co-workers, kind but guarded. She had a rhythm, and she kept to it. What she didn't share, what even those close to her couldn't quite define, was what life was like behind her front door. The first interviews were with colleagues from the school. They were consistent in their praise. Tanya was professional, private, and deeply committed to her role. She stayed after hours, rarely took personal time, and seemed to thrive on structure. But beneath the reliability was something more subtle. A few described her as tired, not in the physical sense, but emotionally drained in ways they couldn't put into words. One colleague remembered Tanya once saying, "I don't like to go home early. I do better when I stay busy. At the time, it didn't sound alarming. In hindsight, it landed differently. There was no specific complaint, no direct accusation, just a pattern, a preference for staying at school, avoiding weekends, and declining invitations after hours. Detectives next spoke to neighbors. The Vishards were known, but only by name. Vincent mowed his lawn every week. Tanya waved from the mailbox. They weren't the kind of couple that hosted barbecues or lingered in conversation. They kept to themselves, one neighbor said. Another added, you wouldn't think anything was wrong, but you also wouldn't know if it was. Nobody had heard arguments. No one had seen Tanya leave in distress. But no one could say they truly knew what went on in that house. Family interviews were more difficult. Tanya's relatives lived out of town and admitted that contact had grown infrequent. She sent holiday cards. She called on birthdays. But in the last 2 years, the calls had grown shorter. One sibling described it as polite distance. There was no falling out, just a slow and quiet retreat. When asked about her marriage, the most common response was neutral. They seemed fine. But detectives knew that fine was often the most deceptive word in domestic cases. It usually meant no one was looking too closely. Digging deeper, investigators requested access to Tanya's medical history, not for signs of physical abuse, but for patterns of stress-related symptoms. What they found added layers to the picture. Over the past 18 months, Tanya had seen her physician several times for insomnia, headaches, and unexplained fatigue. There was no official mental health diagnosis, but her primary care notes suggested persistent anxiety. She had refused medication. Instead, she asked for strategies to stay focused and manage her schedule better. This reinforced what investigators were beginning to suspect, not about the method of the crime, but about the environment it had grown from. Control, not chaos. Pressure, not violence. A slow erosion rather than a visible collapse. The home was re-examined with this context in mind. Every item, every placement was looked at not just for forensic value, but for insight. Tanya's side of the bedroom closet was carefully arranged by season. Her workspace in the guest room was separate from the shared living areas. There were handwritten notes about school policies, student birthdays, and parent-teacher meetings, but none about her personal life. Notably absent, family photos. There were framed certificates, artwork from students, but few images of her and Vincent together. In the master bedroom, one photo had been removed from the wall. A faint outline remained where the frame had once hung. Detectives began cross-referencing digital records. Tanya's email and text history revealed very little about her home life. But what stood out was how few personal exchanges existed at all. Her phone usage centered on school communications. Her search history showed occasional queries related to anxiety and feeling overwhelmed, but nothing more direct. A forensic psychologist was consulted. Their preliminary assessment was clear. Tanya exhibited signs of long-term emotional suppression. There were no visible outbursts, no confrontations on record, but she had structured her life to avoid downtime, to stay constantly occupied. It was, in many domestic abuse cases, a coping mechanism, one not often recognized until after the fact. Still, no formal accusations were made. The investigation had to remain rooted in evidence, not speculation. But every new piece of context, every recorded symptom, every hesitant remark from colleagues, tightened the framework of what likely led to Tanya's death. The home had been quiet for years, but that silence now spoke louder than any confession. When a crime unfolds behind closed doors, without witnesses or alarms, investigators depend entirely on what's left behind. Not confessions, not speculation. Tangible things, fibers, timestamps, fluid traces, and broken patterns. The Vishards case quickly became a blueprint for how quiet crimes demand louder evidence. By the time forensic teams had completed their first sweep of the residence, it was clear this wasn't a disorganized or impulsive act. The environment had been carefully controlled. And in cases like this, what hasn't been moved can be more revealing than what has. The bathroom was central. Not just because Tanya's body had been discovered there, but because every corner of that room had been altered, selectively. Bleach had been applied, but not evenly. The original bath mat was missing, the curtain had been replaced, but small particles remained embedded in grout lines and the soft surfaces of tile caulking. Blood traces, once invisible, began to reappear under chemical analysis. Samples were sent to the state crime lab for rapid DNA matching. Blood found under the sink and on a discarded paper towel in the trash bag matched Tanya's profile. What concerned analysts wasn't the presence of blood, it was the absence of blood spray. the kind typically associated with an uncontrolled high-velocity attack. This told them the scene had been deliberately cleaned, and done so shortly after death. In the trunk of the SUV parked outside, technicians recovered black garbage bags, similar to those used to wrap Tanya's body. The material was consistent in size and composition. Inside those bags were cleaning products, partially used, along with gloves and a bloodied bathroom rug. The sequence was becoming clear. An attempt had been made to contain the aftermath, not to flee from it. The evidence pointed to a timeline that was unnaturally calm. There were no frantic disposal efforts, no attempts to leave the state or stage a burglary. It was containment, calculated, step-by-step decisions that seemed designed not to escape, but to delay discovery. From the moment the body was located, investigators began working backwards. Tanya had last been seen alive 2 days prior to the welfare check. She had not contacted co-workers, friends, or family. She had not left a note, initiated any appointments, or taken steps to indicate a voluntary disappearance. That absence mattered. Phone records were examined next. Her device had been stationary since the evening of her disappearance. No calls, no texts. Location data never left the house. A review of her husband's phone showed activity the following morning. A brief call to a local hardware store, one not connected to any purchase. Internet history revealed searches related to industrial cleaning products. No other phones had connected to the home's Wi-Fi in the time window under scrutiny. The garage was examined thoroughly. A mop bucket was found, containing cloudy water. Lab tests confirmed diluted traces of human blood. A box of nitrile gloves had 3 pairs missing. The garbage bin was empty, recently cleared. Trash collection schedules confirmed it had been picked up just hours before officers arrived. Even household items told part of the story. The washing machine still contained damp towels. Testing confirmed they had been used in cleanup efforts. No other laundry was present. The dryer was empty. Security footage from neighboring houses filled in more gaps. One video captured Vincent early in the morning, opening the rear of his SUV, placing a large object inside a bag, standing motionless for several seconds, and then returning inside without ever driving away. No additional visitors, no unknown vehicles, just silence. The movement pattern was odd. He wasn't attempting to leave, but he was relocating something, possibly cleaning supplies or contaminated items. That brief, unexplained trip to the car suggested a second stage of concealment or an abandoned plan to discard evidence off-site. At this stage in the investigation, detectives were no longer seeking random suspects. They were methodically narrowing scope. Every piece of forensic data pointed to actions taken inside the home, involving no third-party access. What they didn't yet have was motive, or an admission. Behavioral analysts joined the case to provide insight into the profile of whoever committed the crime. The absence of impulsive violence paired with methodical concealment suggested someone emotionally detached or operating under suppressed pressure rather than rage. The act lacked overkill or personal marking. It was sanitized, literally and symbolically. This led the team to re-examine previous interactions with Tanya. Her avoidance of home life, subtle signs of anxiety, and increasing isolation had already raised red flags. Now the practical behaviors after her death reinforced the theory. This wasn't a spontaneous explosion, it was a slow implosion, years of disconnection collapsing into a single irreversible act. Still, the investigators had to follow procedure. They requested Tanya's financial records, emails, search history, and any past legal disputes. There were no large cash withdrawals, secret accounts, or attempts to leave the relationship. There was also no signed power of attorney, updated will, or evidence she had sought protection. Her digital life was routine, boring even, but it only made the contrast starker. A person like Tanya didn't vanish in a dramatic outburst. She vanished in silence. And that silence, so well maintained in life, had become the center of the case in death. The investigative team prepared a full report of the forensic timeline: time of death, estimated method of concealment, steps taken to clean, and lack of outside interference. From there, the case shifted into its next phase, linking this timeline to one individual through statements, inconsistencies, and behavior. There was no denying what had happened. Now it was a matter of proving who, when, and how, beyond reasonable doubt. The closer investigators drew to the truth, the quieter it all seemed. No violent outbursts, no telltale breakdowns, no slips in public behavior. What unraveled inside the Vuishar home had happened without spectacle. The absence of chaos had now become the loudest clue. Once forensic evidence pointed conclusively to an internal act, one committed by someone with unrestricted access to the scene, attention shifted to behavioral analysis. The goal was no longer just to reconstruct the steps, but to understand the mind that took them. Behavioral forensics isn't based on instinct or opinion. It is pattern recognition, informed by psychology and supported by data. Analysts dissect language, timelines, inconsistencies, and emotional cues, or the lack thereof. In this case, the stillness was what stood out. Emotionally, nothing seemed to move. No tears, no rage, no fear, just calm. During multiple interviews, the man who lived in the home where Tanya had died displayed an emotional neutrality that went beyond shock. His answers were short, devoid of spontaneity. There was no indignation, no sense of injustice. He did not express concern about who might have harmed his wife. He did not ask what had been found or how. Investigators cataloged these responses as part of his baseline behavior. His initial statements had already contained inconsistencies. He claimed Tanya had gone out, yet her belongings remained inside. He stated he hadn't heard from her, but hadn't attempted to contact her, even hours after she failed to come home. He showed no evidence of searching, no outreach to her colleagues, no calls to friends or hospitals. The silence wasn't just after the incident. It had come before it. Specialists from the FBI's behavioral unit were consulted for a profile review. The preliminary assessment drew on cases involving intimate partner homicides, where emotional detachment followed prolonged, unaddressed resentment or feelings of inferiority. The theory wasn't new. Sometimes control becomes a substitute for connection. And when control slips, the response is not explosive, but methodical, clinical. The autopsy results strengthened that theory. Tanya had no defensive wounds, no signs of prolonged struggle, no injuries inconsistent with a single cause of death. She hadn't fought back, or hadn't had time. It implied either a surprise attack or one from someone she hadn't perceived as a threat until it was too late. Adding to this, the aftermath, the wrapping, the cleaning, the containment, reflected deliberate choices. There was time taken, not to flee, not to panic, but to reset, hide, minimize discovery. None of these actions reflected guilt, at least not in the traditional sense. They reflected preservation. Psychologists reviewing the case labeled the response cold accommodation, a state where the individual accepts what's been done, but avoids internal confrontation. In such cases, remorse doesn't manifest as confession. It manifests as inaction and silence. The goal isn't escape, but delay. Time becomes a tool, to distance, not to run. Further examination of digital behavior continued to support the hypothesis. There was no evidence of an attempt to cover tracks online, no deletion of browser history, no sudden erasure of text messages or call logs. There was no attempt to create an alibi. The lack of cover-up was, in itself, a red flag. In similar cases, this indicated either a complete denial of wrongdoing or a detachment from the consequences. From a legal standpoint, these observations would later be used not to prove guilt alone, but to establish state of mind, intent, premeditation. Meanwhile, prosecutors began assembling a prosecutable narrative. Circumstantial evidence on its own needed to be supported by motive or psychological indicators to present a coherent case. Forensic results had drawn the map. Now human behavior had to walk it. Detectives re-interviewed former coworkers and family members, this time with refined questions. Had anyone noticed unusual behavior in the days before Tanya disappeared? A change in mood, financial tension, a sense that something had shifted? Most said no. But one detail emerged from a colleague at school. Tanya had recently begun storing materials in her car that she normally kept at home. Lesson plans, personal folders, a planner. She told the coworker it was just easier this way. It was subtle, but it aligned with patterns of someone emotionally separating from their domestic space. She was beginning, it seemed, to create distance, quietly. Other findings added context. Tanya had recently canceled a routine doctor's appointment she never missed. She hadn't rescheduled, a small thing, but not without weight in the broader picture. When people begin to untether, they often lose the energy to maintain routines that no longer feel relevant. The case now stood on a solid foundation of forensic evidence, behavioral patterns, and logistical contradictions. Still, no confession had been made. There had been no breakdown in questioning, no outburst, just stillness. That in itself became central to the prosecution's theory. When the storm is internal, it leaves no mess, only residue. And Tanya, who had lived a life defined by structure and silence, had died in that same pattern. not in chaos but in calculation. What remained now was the presentation of this evidence in court, where patterns must become proof. The wheels of justice rarely turn quickly, but when they do, it's because the path has been cleared by consistency, by evidence that speaks louder than argument, and silence that cuts deeper than denial. In the case of Tanya Vuchar's death, there were no eyewitnesses, no dramatic confessions, no viral moments captured on video. There was only a timeline built on scientific precision and behavior that told its own version of the truth. When the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office formally filed charges, it wasn't done in response to a single breakthrough. It was the culmination of months of layered verification. Every document, every lab report, every data point had been scrutinized to ensure no assumption was left unchallenged. A case like this needed to be airtight, because the presentation to a jury would rely entirely on logic, not spectacle. From the beginning, prosecutors knew what they were up against. The defendant had not confessed. He had not fled. He had not shown visible hostility, but neither had he acted like a grieving husband. And in that in-between space, where neither innocence nor guilt is spoken aloud, jurors must be guided, not pushed. That required clarity, restraint, and discipline. In pre-trial hearings, the defense team attempted to suppress several key pieces of evidence, including the video footage from a neighbor's security system and certain statements made during initial interviews. The argument was procedural, suggesting Miranda rights had not been fully administered prior to casual questioning. But the judge ruled that all evidence had been collected lawfully, and the trial would proceed with the full breadth of material available to the state. The prosecution opened not with emotion but with precision. They outlined a timeline, anchored in time-stamped footage, cell phone records, and forensic results. They laid out the physical structure of the crime scene, the locations where blood had been found, and the sequence of cleaning efforts conducted before law enforcement arrived. No adjectives, no dramatization, just fact after fact layered until the picture became clear. They did not describe the defendant as a monster. They described him as quiet, methodical, and deeply aware of what he was doing. A man who did not lose control but took control, right up until the moment he could no longer contain what he had done. The defense countered with a narrative of confusion and emotional fatigue. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed, struggling with isolation, and possibly experiencing a dissociative break. They suggested the possibility of accidental death, followed by panic. The details of that panic, wrapping a body in multiple garbage bags, changing shower curtains, wiping tile seams with bleach, were explained as the irrational actions of a man in shock. To a jury, both stories had elements of plausibility, but the prosecution had evidence. And when a case hinges on who can sustain logic longer under pressure, physical facts usually win. Forensic experts were called to testify. They explained the blood patterns, or rather, the lack of them. They detailed the cleaning agents found in the suspect's vehicle, the matching trash bags in the bathroom and car, and the DNA evidence retrieved from beneath the fingernails of the victim, none of which belonged to an outside party. A digital analyst confirmed that no other individual had entered the Wi-Fi zone of the Vuchard home during the 2-day window in question. A pathologist confirmed that Tanya's wound was consistent with a sharp, single, deliberate strike, not a scuffle. No bruising on her hands, no signs of falling, no blunt trauma elsewhere. Then came the behavioral experts. They didn't speculate, they interpreted. They explained that certain types of offenders don't express remorse through tears or pleas, but through detachment. That people who feel emotionally cornered may act with stunning calculation, not in rage, but in resolve. And that in long-term domestic situations marked by emotional imbalance, violence often comes not during a fight, but after years of no fight at all. The jury listened. Some took notes. Most sat motionless. What stood out during trial wasn't what was said, but how little resistance there was. The defense didn't refute the evidence directly. They attempted to reframe it, to dilute its intent. But reframing a fingerprint or a timestamp rarely shifts perception. What was missing from their strategy was an alternative explanation that held up under cross-examination. There was no suggestion of another suspect, no third-party theory, just an ambiguous plea for understanding in the face of overwhelming procedural fact. The defendant never took the stand. The choice was legal and expected, but the absence spoke loudly. The jury was left to interpret his silence as they had interpreted his actions. Closing arguments from the prosecution returned to the theme of deliberation. They asked the jurors to consider not just what happened, but what didn't happen. No call to 911. No attempt to seek help. No effort to explain. Just silence, bags, bleach, and a body hidden in a bathroom. The verdict came after 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty of second-degree murder. The charge reflected the court's view. The act was intentional, but perhaps not planned in advance. It was not a conviction rooted in fury, but in fatal indifference. At sentencing, the judge spoke with brevity. He acknowledged the gravity of the crime, the professionalism of the investigators, and the life lost. There were no statements from the defendant, no apologies, just a nod, life imprisonment without parole. There were no outbursts in the courtroom, no weeping, no visible emotion at all. Just a quiet exit as another door closed, this time behind reinforced walls. Justice, even when delivered, does not restore what's been lost. It documents it, explains it, names it, but it cannot undo it. Tanya Vuchard's story did not end with the conviction. It ended before that, in a bathroom scrubbed too clean, in a house where routine masked detachment, and in a life slowly reduced to silence. After the trial, there were no public vigils, no national headlines. This was not a case that went viral. It wasn't built for outrage or attention. It was, fittingly, quiet. Tanya's colleagues returned to their classrooms. A scholarship in her name was quietly organized by a group of teachers who remembered her not for the way she died, but for the way she showed up, consistently, calmly for others. At her memorial, the most repeated phrase was, "She didn't deserve this." But that truth extended beyond the crime. Tanya didn't deserve the years of shrinking space, the weight of emotional withdrawal, or the slow erasure of her presence inside her own home. Her case left behind uncomfortable questions. How do we recognize distress when it comes without bruises? When does someone become so invisible that their absence feels delayed? Why do some lives fracture without sound? The people closest to Tanya described her as strong, reliable, and self-contained, but strength without support becomes burden. And silence, in time, can become a form of isolation no one notices until it's too late. Law enforcement considered the case closed. The legal process was complete, but in the field of criminal investigation, every story leaves patterns, signs others can learn from. Tanya's was a blueprint in what it looks like when emotional imbalance lives undetected behind suburban walls. There were no villains in the shadows, no sudden outbursts, just one home, one timeline. One decision made in stillness, and a woman remembered by her absence more than she ever allowed herself to be seen in life. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.